150 years ago this month, with his army surrounded and his men weak and exhausted, Robert E. Lee realized that there was little choice but to consider the surrender of his army to General Grant. The surrender took place on April 9th of 1865 at the Appomattox Courthouse. And it brought an end, as we well know, to the bloodiest conflict in our nation's history. On April 10th, the citizens were pressuring Lincoln to give a great victory speech. But he waited 2 days because he didn't want to make a mistake. So on the evening of April 11th, Lincoln spoke from the balcony of the north portico of the White House. And there was boisterous applause and great cheers. But Lincoln disappointed them. It wasn't a rousing victory speech that he gave. Instead, he spoke of a righteous and a speedy peace. And he devoted the bulk of his talk, his address, to Reconstruction. He called for black suffrage. His talk wasn't about revenge. His talk was about reunion. The previous week, he was asked about the prisoners, and he stated, "Let them up easy." In his second inaugural address, he quoted scripture, "Judge not, lest ye be judged." In that April 11th speech, lurking in the background was John Wilkes Booth. And he remarked, as he and his co-conspirator Lewis Powell walked away, "That is the last speech he will ever make." And of course, we all know 3 days later, John Wilkes Booth made good on his threat. We come together this weekend and we hear Jesus telling us that he is the good shepherd who is willing to lay down his life for his sheep. In Jesus telling us this, what he is really talking about is true leadership. That the true leader is not about his own needs and wants, but the true leader is about the common good. After Lincoln's death, his funeral train made the circuitous route journey from Washington, D.C. to his hometown of Springfield, Illinois. As his entourage was passing through the streets of Lower Manhattan, an elderly black woman was heard saying, "He died for me. God bless him." It was 150 years ago tomorrow, April 26th, that Lincoln's funeral train passed through the city of Syracuse. Now, 100 years ago, on April 15th of 1915, Ottoman authorities rounded up and arrested some 250 Armenian intellectuals and community leaders in Constantinople. There were 2 phases. The first phase was the wholesale killing of able-bodied males. And the second phase was the deportation of women, children, and elderly on death marches to the Syrian desert. It is estimated that between 1 and 1.5 million people were killed. On Divine Mercy Sunday, just 2 weeks ago, Pope Francis called this genocide. And by his calling this genocide, it sparked a diplomatic rift with Turkey at a very delicate time in the Christian-Muslim relations. The Turkish foreign minister to the Vatican was recalled, saying that the Pope's message was unacceptable. Well, if one is a true shepherd, often one's messages are unacceptable to certain groups of people. And once again in the gospel, we hear Jesus saying, I am the good shepherd and will lay down my life for my sheep. A good shepherd often says things that people do not want to hear. A good shepherd often comforts the afflicted and afflicts the comfortable. Lincoln was, Francis is, a good example of shepherds who are more concerned about the common good than they are about their needs, their wants, or their reputation. David Brooks, writing in the New York Times a couple of weeks ago, described his desire to find people who radiate an inner light, people who are deeply good, people who listen well, people who make you feel valued. He tells us that when he meets this kind of a person, it brightens his whole day. But he admits that he has not himself yet achieved this kind of generosity or depth of character. He writes that to have this kind of character, he must work much harder to have some sort of moral adventures. He goes on to tell us that wonderful people are made, they're not born. And he writes of two kinds of virtues. He writes of resume virtues and eulogy virtues. Now, the resume virtues are the skills that we bring to the marketplace. The eulogy virtues are the ones that are talked about at our funerals. And we live in a culture that places much more emphasis on the resume virtues for career purposes, rather than on the qualities that we need to radiate that deep inner life. And Brooks tells us that if we spend our whole lives on the resume virtues, living for external achievement, then the very deepest part of ourselves goes unexplored and unstructured, and we can easily slip into self-satisfaction. As long as we're not hurting anybody, that people seem to like us, then we must be okay. But what he writes is that this can lead us to unconscious boredom, separated from the deepest meaning of life and life's highest joys. Eulogy virtues consist of being honest with our own weaknesses, knowing we can't do it alone, turning a career into a calling, seeing our own suffering as pieces of the larger narrative, seeing life as a moral drama, and feeling fulfilled only when we are enmeshed in a struggle on behalf of some ideal. The question, Brooks writes, is not, what do I want from life? But the question, he says, is what is life asking of me? And how can I match my intrinsic talent with one of the world's deepest needs? That's the question that the true leader asks, the question of the true shepherd. What is life asking of me? Certainly 150 years ago, Abraham Lincoln asked that question and answered it with his life. I believe Francis is asking the question today, and he lives with tremendous admiration, but he also lives with tremendous criticism, even from bishops and cardinals. But both are truly examples of the challenge to be the good shepherd, who lays down his life for his sheep. It was also 2 weeks ago on Divine Mercy Sunday, April 11th, that Francis released a document entitled Misericordiae Vultus, the face of mercy. And what he has done is that he's proclaimed a Jubilee year, which begins December 8th of this year. A Jubilee year that challenges you and me as church to refashion ourselves as a place not of judgment and condemnation, but a place of pardon and merciful love. He wrote this, he said, "Perhaps we have long since forgotten how to show and live the way of mercy. The temptation to focus exclusively on justice made us forget that this is only the first, albeit necessary and indispensable step. The time has come for the church to take up the joyful call to mercy once more." Well, in that article a couple of weeks ago, David Brooks described what a true shepherd and a true leader is. One who is generous, with a depth of character, who is not the least bored with life because he or she is involved in the deepest meaning of life and its highest joys. Because the shepherd and the true leader always asks the question, what is life asking of me? How can I match my intrinsic talent with one of the world's deepest needs?